my first ever time at the Times Litfest, my first time in Mumbai, my first time in India. I am triply excited. It's really wonderful. And I'm very happy to be chairing this session. I didn't realize you were each going to get introduced already, so I might just reintroduce you nevertheless. I'm really happy to be here with Pallavi Iyer, who's a prolific journalist who's written on a vast range of subjects from Europe to China to Indonesia. She's now a freelance journalist based in Tokyo. She's written numerous books, including Punjabi Parmesan. And this year, she has published not one, but 2 books, Choked, on living and bringing up children in a state of pollution in Asian cities. But also the book which is probably most relevant to our discussion now, Babies and Bylines, on the experience of pregnancy and children as a modern woman in different countries, different continents. And you describe yourself as feeling marooned without a map, initially anyway. I'm also really happy to welcome Deborah Cohen, Professor of Humanities and History at Northwestern University. Deborah is the author of several books on social history, of which her latest is the most relevant to our discussion. It's called Family Secrets, Shame and Privacy in Modern Britain. It's an amazing book which tells some extraordinary stories of experiences of family life among the British, both in Britain and in India, and the kinds of shame and secrets that people lived by when so-called imbecile children might be hidden away, or homosexual family members might be passed off as bachelor uncles. And finally, I'm delighted to welcome Mahesh Rao. I'm sure his brilliant fiction will be familiar to many of you in the room. He's the author of The Smoke is Rising, and most recently, a really wonderful collection of short stories that I encourage you all to read if you haven't already, 1.2 billion. It's a haunting, humorous, and panoramic collection set in India. And many of these stories are about, among other things, the ironies, the complexities of families in India today. So our topic today is listed as Diaper Dads, Briefcase Mums, and Family Dynamics for Millennial Munchkins. And I must confess that much as I love talking about families, when I read this title, I felt slightly annoyed. I bridled slightly because it's offering us up these 3 stereotypes. I have 3 children myself. I'm not sure if any of them is a millennial munchkin. I've met numerous fathers in the UK who change nappies, and I'm not aware of them ever saying, "Hi, I'm a diaper dad." And in my 17 years of being a working mother, I've owned many extremely messy handbags, but never a briefcase. But I guess the point of our discussion today is partly to talk about the stereotypes that we all live by and live within and sometimes attempt to combat and live against, and to unpack the realities behind those stereotypes. And as was mentioned at the beginning, I'm mainly a writer about food, so when I saw the title of the panel, I immediately thought it was all about feeding, and the panelists kindly point out, no, there's more to families than just food. But I just wanted to begin with one thought or observation that I had in my most recent book, First Bite, about the profound ways in which feeding children have changed over the 20th century. In the UK, at least, it may be different in India, which is that at the early part of the 20th century, it was thought positively good for children's souls and for their bodies to feed them food which they disliked. The plainer, the blander, the better. The whole idea of Edwardian nursery food is you mustn't excite a child through food. And then in the post-war years, we had this influx of food which was offering exactly the opposite approach, that to be a good parent, you should be giving your child kids' food, much of which was being quite cynically marketed by big commercial food companies. And this food was so likable, it was almost like a toy. You have kind of weird cheese strings that were twistable, stringable, dunkable. And I guess what I see happening in this shift in feeding is You could say it's about food, but you could say it's about so many other things as well. The era in which people offered Edwardian nursery food was one in which parents felt that they were the ones who knew best, and they didn't maybe have the guilt about going out to work that so many modern mothers have. And equally, there wasn't this cynical industrial food supply pushing this stuff. So I think in all of our discussions today, the sorts of changes we're looking at, we're living in a very complex world, and each of you in your different ways are grappling with questions of how individuals live with that complexity and make sense of it. So I wanted to start with Pallavi. As I've said, you've written Choked, you've written Babies and Bylines. One of your themes is that we're bringing up children in a very toxic world, and the kinds of trade-offs that we have as modern parents might be different from in the past and might be the same. Can you say a bit more about that?
Thank you, Bea. You know, we're talking today about family dynamics for the millennial munchkins. And that seems to imply that the family dynamics for millennials are vastly different from family dynamics that have gone before. And one thing that has really surprised me through my own experience of having children is how much things have sort of remained the same even as things have changed. When I first got married, I married a Spaniard from Spain, and our relationship was very sort of post-feminist, if you like. You know, we thought that a lot of the gender roles that are mentioned in the topic for today were things that had been settled. We had a kind of genderless marriage. It was not an issue. You know, we both worked. He cooked or I cooked. Well, actually, I don't cook that much, but he cooked. And it wasn't. It was. You know, gender wasn't something we did. It sort of belonged to other people, perhaps, but not to us. And then we had a child, and then another child. And gender suddenly, you know, emerged in our relationship like a bucking bronco, almost, and has defined a lot of the decisions that I've taken and my personal biography in the last 10 years, to a much greater extent than I had expected. And as you said, it's not because he hasn't changed a diaper or two in his time. But parenting is a lot more than just changing a few diapers. And certainly, while I think fathers do more of that kind of, you know, baby work than, say, 20 or 30 years ago, what hasn't changed is that women, in a lot of partnerships, tend to kind of remain the warriors in chief. And so the qualitative difference, rather than the quantitative difference, has persisted. So in terms of some amount of time, men now spend more time with their children. But it's in the experience of that time, how that time is felt, that a lot of these differences, I think, have persisted. Women tend to just generally feel more frantic. There's a sense that at any given moment, there might be a pot boiling over somewhere. So there's this sort of sense of urgency, a sort of experience of pressure points during the day, which comes from sort of balancing all of these things that we have to, that men till today, I think, don't really experience in the same way. So there's this, yes.
Do you think that that pressure is self-generated by women? Is it generated by society? Is it generated within the relationship? Where does it come from?
I don't know. I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that. I do think that it's self-generated to an extent, and it's generated by sort of social and cultural conditioning to an extent. So, for example, schools till today tend to focus a lot more on moms. I mean, I get all the emails from school about, you know, tomorrow is raisin day and day after is banana day, and remember to like pack the swimming outfit. I mean, I've been here for 4 days, and my child yesterday had a fairy tale party, has a Christmas show on Monday, has to have labeled bags sent in with 3 different kinds of things. And I think, you know, my husband will take over, but that's the difference. I think that there's a sense that the buck stops with me, whereas he doesn't have that sense. He can sort of step in as a surrogate primary caregiver when necessary. But, you know, ultimately the buck stops with me. If he forgets, it's sort of forgivable. And that is something that's shown a remarkable persistence. And we also see it in careers, in the fact that, you know, it's really impossible to bring up children and continue to work in a very brutal capitalist system where you have to, essentially overwork is rewarded and flexibility is underpaid, appreciated. And, under those conditions, women tend to be penalized. And I've very much seen my career graph going from, being a full-time journalist, ready to travel at the drop of a hat and so on, to more and more essentially becoming a book writer and a trailing spouse. And there's been a lot of sort of financial implications for that. So it's ended up being a much more gendered relationship where the sort of primary bread earner has ended up being my husband, and I am the primary caregiver in many ways. It's very hard to get around these dynamics.
And do you see that as being something essential to having children that you can't imagine changing, or?
Well, I certainly think that having children is transformative, and it takes a huge amount of time. And so that time has to come from somewhere. And at the moment, I don't think work culture recognizes our roles as sort of complete human beings. And even when you're looking at policy in the workplace or at the government level, at the most you look at the first year of a baby, you look at maternity leave. And that's certainly not the be-all and end-all of most human beings' trajectory as carers. You look after your children for, a good 18 to 20 years. It gets more and more complex as they get older. It was something I was very surprised to find out, because I'd also focused a lot on the first year. I was going to do this for 6 months, and I was going to go back to work. And I hadn't really thought about what happens when they're 3 and 4 and 8, and then when they're teenagers. And then at the same time, you have to also take care of ailing parents. Essentially, your role as a carer in society, I think, is often just not adequately factored in to the work culture.
I'm going to bring in Deborah now. So you've talked a lot about the extent to which, in the modern world, even with all of these apparent advantages and things having changed and moved on, your identity after you have children is very much defined through those children. Deborah's book is looking at how families form their identities in different ways. The extent to which families, for a long time in Britain especially, were modulated by shame. You also talk about India, but you had a great quote. Somebody in the 19th century said, "India is a place without secrets compared to Britain." Clearly, there is still shame in India, and we might get onto that with Mahesh. But Deborah, can you say a bit more about how families used to play out in Britain and how that changed?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you all hear me? Is the volume okay? Excellent. So I think one thing I'd want to say, just kind of following up on some of Pallavi's points, is really the main transformation that's so noticeable in the last 40 years is this massive demographic shift. So on average, people used to have 5 to 6 children, right, across the world, and now they have 2 to 3. And that's happened, essentially there's a European and an American shift that happens in the 1920s and 30s, and in the rest of the world, this is a shift that is kind of ongoing and especially accelerating the last 40 years. And what's really interesting about that is it has all sorts of implications for, I think, not just what families are, what children are to families, but also how families think about themselves and their own behavioral patterns. And so I just want to talk about 2 implications of that. I mean, one of them is, kind of goes back to the question that you were asking, which is, to what extent are women themselves kind of placing themselves under more and more obligations and responsibilities vis-a-vis children? What we know is that children become much more precious when there are fewer of them, which doesn't mean that parents didn't love their children when they had more of them, but there's a much more intensive focus on parenting with 2 to 3 children. So this is what the sociologist Vivian Zelizer has called the priceless child. So a child who's economically useless, but actually emotionally priceless. But the second thing that I would want to say is that what's really interesting when you go from these families, with 5 and 6 as the average, is that what you're really talking about is how the normative family changes. Because say if you look at Britain and Europe in the 1870s, you have as many families, as many couples who have 11 plus children as you do couples who have 0 children, 1 child, 4 children, 5 children. In other words, there is actually no normal family size. And that had a huge range of implications for what people thought families were actually supposed to be. And what I'd argue, and this is one of the points I make in the book, is that larger families had much more toleration for variance and also for dependence. So you have the queer uncle or the bachelor uncle. You could have a disabled child in a Victorian family who would really be a cherished member of that family. And it's only in the 1920s and 30s that children, mentally disabled children in Britain, start to get hidden away and their existence erased. So for the Victorian family, again, these oftentimes very large families, very non-normative families in many ways, behave not as we would expect in stigmatizing difference, but actually have a greater toleration for it.
And is that partly because when you have fewer children, suddenly the parent feels that that child is hugely a reflection on them, whereas if you have 11 children, you can see they're 11 very different people, and you can accommodate that. So I almost wonder if there are extraordinary stories in your book of parents, all sorts of secrecy and shame. The book starts with a woman who adopts a child, but she's so desperate for her friends not to realize that she's adopted that she kind of goes away in hiding for a couple of months so that she just might have been heavily pregnant and then miraculously appears with this child, as if it would have been such a terrible thing to say, here's this child and I've adopted.
Yeah, and that's to me, so the story that Bea is telling is about a woman who goes into a nursing home. She's quite a rich woman, and she goes into a nursing home and then kind of presumably appears with some padded clothing and gets a child from an adoption agency whom she produces then as her own. And this is an absolute secret. Everyone involved sworn to secrecy through the adoption agency. So yes, I think that, that people focus much more attention when there are fewer people. On the other hand, I think the other important point, and for anyone who comes from a big family, this is obvious, when you have 11 children, you actually know how much variation there is. Whereas with 1 and 2, that your N still is 1, to say it in a statistical way. So by which I mean that you actually have very little experience of the full range of human kind of variation that can happen.
So I wanted to move to Mahesh now. Your book, Deborah, ends with a kind of opening up of families. In the 1960s, Britain discovering thinkers, psychoanalysts who are saying, actually, the family with its sort of emphasis on shame is responsible for our mental ill health, and people just shrugging off these shackles and saying, no, let's just get rid of secrecy, let's get rid of shame, let's share. And you end with Facebook, the kind of ultimate form of modern sharing. I was fascinated in so many of your stories, Mahesh, the extent to which you bring out the ways in which there is still a tension between people living in open societies, in closed societies, differing value systems. There was one quote so many things I could quote. There's a story about a stepmother called The Pool, and the stepdaughter who really doesn't she's not even quite a stepmother, she's her dad's girlfriend. She starts to yell at Jay again. Okay, not exactly yell, more that firm but not totally losing it growl she does so well because it shows good modern parenting. Can you say some more about good modern parenting and families?
Well, thank you. And I've been listening to all the talk of secrets, lies, and shame, and I suppose a normal reaction would be to sort of feel sorry for these families and all the secrets buried within them. But as a fiction writer, my ears just prick up, and actually my pulse starts to race whenever you mention secrets and lies and shame, because this is really the kind of the raw materials that most fiction writers work with. And personally, I raid people's families all the time, whether they know it or not. And I'm kind of revealing this now, which probably means that no one will ever say anything in my presence ever again. But so many of the stories in the collection and the things I work on, the fabric of them are the conflicts within families. And it's really important because certainly in India, where society is changing and has always been changing, but now change is much more rapid, I think. And one of the key things over the last 20, 30 years is the breakdown of the joint family system, where grandparents would live in the same house with lots of their sons and their wives and lots of their children. And I once heard an anecdote about a young woman who lived in one of these joint family systems, and she accused her father-in-law of peeking at her through the bathroom window. And this completely split the family, because half the family believed her and sort of felt, I've always felt he was a dirty old man, slightly dodgy. He looks like the kind of person who would peek at young women through a bathroom window. And then the other half of the family was on the woman's side, on the man's side, saying that, he's never done anything like this in the family before. She's just accusing him, she's an attention grabber, this sort of thing.
And this then becomes your story, The Agony of Leaves.
It was the spark for one of the stories in the collection, because when I started to think about it, I thought this must actually happen all the time, because you have young women living at very close proximity with older men, and it's very possible for a bit of kindness, a bit of consideration to be misconstrued as love or lust or any of these things, and things can just snowball from there. And it's all about sort of shifting power dynamics within the family as well. I mean, who controls the money? Where does the income come from? The expectation of an inheritance. All of these things kind of muddy the waters and make people see what they want to see essentially in these relationships. So it's really rich and fertile ground for a lot of fiction writing. Another anecdote that made it into the story, into the collection as a story, was actually from Spain. A friend of mine was telling me about someone they knew. She was brought up by a single parent, and in a very leftist kind of family. They were extremely proud to have fought on the Republican side during the Civil War. They were extremely anti-Franco. This was the badge of honor that the family wore. All trade union members, feminists, you can sort of imagine the kind of family this was. And then a secret emerged fairly recently that a whole branch of the family had actually collaborated with Franco's side. And, a mass grave had been found on some of their land where they'd killed a lot of the Republicans. So, this is kind of a fascinating insight into someone's psyche. What do you do when your identity is so caught up with a certain kind of politics, with a certain kind of belief, and then you discover, and also because that belief you feel has threaded through your family, and it's kind of almost been passed down through the generations, and then you discover that a lot of it is based on a lie. So I used that and transplanted it into modern India, into Rajasthan, where you have this wealthy landowning family, and the young woman who comes from this family, but again, as a very leftist kind of young woman. She's an academic, she believes in human rights, she's studying abroad, and she's lecturing abroad. She's very interested in human rights violations in East Timor. So it's this kind of background that she's now in, and then she discovers that there is a mass grave on her family's estate, and what it eventually is the killing of Dalits by the family during a conflict over land. So, these are very transferable conflicts, wherever they occur, whether it's Spain or the UK, as you've studied, or wherever. The issues are complex enough to be transplanted because they concern the same things: class, gender, all of those things.
And as you said, identity. I felt that so many of the stories are about people either assuming or rejecting certain familial roles. Like the father-in-law, who feels a very moral man. He's never been lewd. You say, I have been a husband. I knew that there are secrets, but at the same time, he's someone that's never looked at anyone other than his wife. And So he's almost taken aback to find that he's lusting after his daughter-in-law. There's another story where a little boy, his father dies, and there's a paragraph about how he doesn't want to become the man of the house in ways that people are seeming to foist this role upon him. And what you've been talking about, Pallavi, is almost sort of this feeling of, well, you didn't think there was this role you were going to assume of the person that has to manage everything because previously your relationship hadn't been like that, and somehow it's almost been foisted upon you. I'm sure you all have things to say to each other now of ways in which to follow up.
Yeah, I did want to follow up to something that Deborah was saying about, changing family dynamics, and something that you mentioned at the beginning about food and how we feed people and how that's changed. And it occurred to me that so much of that has to do with class and how families intersect with class, which is something that you mentioned right now as well. And the very fact of, for example, whether you see a child as an economic resource or as a generator of joy purely has very much to do with class. And certainly in countries like India, I think you see a huge divide between families where children remain essentially an economic resource and families which more and more are now sort of looking at children primarily as something that is to be enjoyed. I certainly come from that class of person, and I have to say that enjoying your children can be quite a lot of hard work. The expectation that you have to get joy from this whole experience all of the time, and it can also be a bit of a shock because so much of it is not joyful but stressful and exhausting and depleting. But we have this narrative about how this is this wonderful thing that's going to happen to you. So it's hard work. Certainly, I think within certain classes, children have really become the center of the family. They've almost sort of replaced religion in many ways. There's the cult of the child where everything about the child is the most important thing. To some extent, I live in this very international expatie bubble. My kids go to international schools, and you have a lot of high-powered parents who are trailing spouses and who put all their energy into their child because they're no longer working. And so there's a huge amount of expectation in terms of what parents are contributing towards the child, and it's a constant 24-hour monitoring of, being crafty, being organic, thinking a lot about what you feed them, for example, which is not my thing, but, people do that a lot. And also in terms of the fact that they're just monitored all the time, they're just never left alone. And when I look back to my childhood, my parents were so ridiculously lax in terms of how we were brought up that I'm amazed we're not dead. And in fact, in family gatherings, they often, sit around joking about, oh, do you remember the time Pali fell into the pond and almost died until Prakash Mosa fished her out, ha, ha, ha. Somebody else is like, oh, and do you remember when Shamal got electrocuted at the wedding until some Mosi switched off the mains, ha, ha, ha. Or when somebody swallowed a ring. And I kind of look at them and say, I wouldn't do that to my kids. That would be appalling today. It would not be considered something that's funny. So certainly, I think...
But it's been a trade-off, hasn't it? That thing you're describing of somebody helicoptering over a child, staring at them all the time,
it's a huge trade-off.
And seeing the child's accomplishments as an extension of your own. I do think sometimes this phrase pushy parent is a bit like diaper dad. It's yet another stereotype, and sometimes it gets bandied about. But you do see children, certainly in the UK, who are so overscheduled that they're going from karate class to tennis class to swimming class.
Mine do that,
I
never expected it.
I'm
So that's another one of those things. Mine do Japanese drumming, Aikido, piano.
But
they
there
learn
are limits.
Japanese.
There are limits.
But yeah, I think that there's a
You
question.
schedule free time. Now you have 10 minutes of free time.
I think that there's a question that goes back to the point about us focusing so much on the first year of life, and that is, are parents going to be more disappointed with their children? Because when they represent this immense investment, not just financial, but emotional, and our projections, it's easy to envision I have a 10-year-old daughter, it's easy to envision a world in which you feel like all that, and for this, it's a horrible thing to contemplate.
I felt that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To bring in food
little children don't disappoint you in that way, but that's also a classic novelistic plot, isn't it? Which is...
Well, mine disappointed me because my first one cried nonstop for 6 months. It was a horrible experience. You're supposed to be joyful and happy, and then I had this monster that just cried all the time and wouldn't let me sleep, which is essentially torture, when you haven't slept in 6 months. And I kid you not when I say I hadn't slept in 6 months. And it was a huge come calm down because, yeah, this was supposed to be something that was joyful. And talking about denial, everybody around me was in denial about how horrible this was. So everyone carried on as though this was a wonderful thing that was happening to me. And I'm talking about my own mother. And, oh, isn't it wonderful? Pali's had this, child. Everyone was calling me to congratulate me. And I just wanted to cry all the time. I hated it. I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. What have I done? And it was very difficult to express those feelings, even to yourself, leave alone to, other people. And so we just all agreed it was a great thing. And it has turned out to be a great thing. And I'm extremely happy I have my child. But the first 6 months were very disappointing, if you want to use that word. They were a shock.
I wonder if, you described the importance of enjoying your children, but in all of this, over-pressurized, over sort of feeling there were expectations for you to work, to be a mother, do various things. I'm bringing it back to food again. But one of the things that we've lost is a kind of non-instrumental view of the family, which to me is the family meal. That was something that just cements people, it brings people together. You can list hundreds of benefits. There are plenty of studies done showing that kids who still sit down and have a family meal, they have better nutrition, they're less likely to be obese, they have better mental health. But the reason for doing it is just, it goes beyond that. There's something about feeding and nurturing that's important in a non-kind of Kumon maths and tennis and achievement kind of way. And I was struck, one of the most beautiful stories in your collection is called The Philanderer, and it starts with this really quite unpleasant character who, as the title suggests, is a philanderer and has a series of affairs. And then he has this one affair with a woman who seems very hard-edged, almost more hard-edged than him. Are we allowed to do plot spoilers? Sorry, I don't...
Yes, we can.
Yeah, we can. And then he accidentally stumbles upon the other side of her life, and he sees the reason she's always in such a hurry and is actually setting the clock when they have these assignations. She'll put a timer on and doesn't want it to last too long, is because she's rushing home to her elderly parents in this quite humble accommodation that smells of overboiled chai, and she's spoon feeding them with soft fruit. And there's something about this kind of collision between these two visions of...
We've been talking quite a lot about childcare and parenting, but the one thing that people really don't talk about enough is, I think, the elderly, which, it's a sort of a ticking time bomb under, most of Western society, but here too, because, aging populations everywhere, and it's something that most of us just won't think about until we absolutely have to. There is a crisis that is precipitated, and then most likely we haven't planned for it, and then it's there. And this is an immensely difficult thing that you have to do. And of course it's cultural as well. So, for example, in India, there are more old age homes than there used to be, but there is still this huge stigma around, putting a parent in a home. There is this notion that you simply don't care for them anymore. And there are people who don't want to go into a home. There is the expense of a home. There are all of these things that you have to factor into. And so, for example, you see rafts of books about parenting, for example, but very few about how to manage the psychological and the social implications of looking after the elderly. And certainly in that story, her guilty secret is that she comes out looking for sex. All she wants is no strings attached sex. And why does she need it? She needs it because she spends her days looking after two very old parents, both with varying degrees of dementia, and her only outlet is to come out and have sex with this one man. And she doesn't want him to know anything about her life, because...
So it's as if caring for the elderly is her other secret, isn't it? When she's leading the life with him, it's her parents who are the secret.
Yeah, because she has no life. This is essentially it, because it's drudgery, it is, and it's annoying, but someone's got to do it, and the key element in all of this is guilt. Guilt kind of fuels families, I think, in many, many ways, whether it's guilt about how you're bringing up your children or the potential neglect of your parents who have brought you up and perhaps given you a good life, or perhaps not. But even if not, I mean, I'm always quite interested to hear about people who, who say they haven't had terribly good relationships with their parents. They've kind of fought for most of their lives, and yet there is a time where compassion just kicks in quite a lot. I think many of us are hardwired for compassion. And so regardless of what has happened in the past, when you see someone at their most vulnerable, they cease to be the monster that perhaps they once were. And suddenly there's a whole new raft of considerations that come into play.
Deborah, do you agree that guilt fuels families?
I think that some terrible combination of guilt and shame, but I mean, optimistically, I guess I would also say that, that love and compassion, and I mean, part of what I was trying to do in the book was to offer another way to understand actually how society changes, so that we have this whole way of talking about social change, like destigmatization of homosexuality, for instance, or illegitimacy, another really good example. And we talk about those as if they're the product of public events like campaigns to change the law or liberationist movements. But I actually think that there's a really good argument to be made that actually what happens at a societal level has actually first happened within families many times. And so that parents find out about something about their child that they haven't, a stigma they haven't really confronted and haven't had to think about. And their first response is to ask, how can we hide it? Meaning, how can we protect ourselves? But in hiding it, they're also basically practicing a kind of moral relativism vis-a-vis whatever it is, illegitimacy, homosexuality, whatever. And that means basically that, the big social sea changes that we see are the product of familial lives that kind of don't come to the fore as visibly.
I think that's a good moment to open it up to audience questions. I'm sure you have, yes, I can see one at the front right away. Can you say who you are and who you're addressing the question particularly to, or to all of them?
Okay. Hi, I'm Arushi, and this question is, I guess, mostly for Pallavi. So basically, there was this music video. Basically, it's about, how mothers are super women, they do it all. And for a long time, even in Indian dramas, we used to have this Tulsi kind of women who used to be like smiling all the time, and they're taking care of house and all that. But now we have these empowered women, but these empowered women are just same Tulsi, but they are basically just going out and working. So they're working at home, they're working outside, they're great daughters, great mothers, great wives, and they're still smiling all the time. So this weird expectation from women to be this superwoman and just do it all and be perfect at it all and just have it all. So isn't that much more demanding than empowering?
Is it much more demanding than people
Yeah,
think?
I know what you mean. Certainly there is this trope around motherhood and women of abnegation, of kind of sacrifice, but with a smile. Yeah, you don't complain. And in many ways, when you've got a briefcase, but you're still doing the diapers, it's taking on more and more. And, essentially, until there is more of a level playing field, both professionally and also at home, which means involving the other half of the parent couple more, you're going to have a situation of asymmetry where there's, a greater burden falling on women. So we've seen that happening. And I think a lot of it is also because of maternity leave. The fact that in the initial months, because women breastfeed and for other reasons, they're the ones who tend to take leave. There is this sort of knock-on effect because the cartography of parenting, the way in which parenting is divided, I think is settled quite early. And so often it's in those first 6 months or 1 year where the mother becomes the primary caregiver, becomes the person who's actually worrying about where the socks are for the child and knows the kind of nitty-gritty, the human resources side, which is what I was talking about, the sort of pressure points, the warrior in chief. And that role ends up being adopted because the mother has to take leave is the one who usually takes leave right in the beginning. And so even when you have these kind of diaper dads later on, because that kind of map has been settled in the beginning, there's certainly a disproportionate amount of housework that continues with women, even if they are working. So yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem, and it's a conundrum that has not been solved.
And sorry, I'm going to ask a follow-up question, and then I'm going to take another one from the audience. It's clearly a cultural problem. It's a cultural problem we have in the UK as well. It's everywhere. To what extent could it be solved by different policies? I mean, the kind of things they have in Scandinavia, where at any point, I just met a friend who's just on leave in Sweden for a year, and she says, it's amazing, free childcare, and you can take this slot of childcare divided equally between the man and the woman, and you can take it at any point, I think, in the first 6 years.
I think Sweden is an excellent example. They both get up to 1 year. And if the man doesn't take it, then they lose it as a couple. There's an incentive to take it. It's not exactly mandatory, but it's very strongly incentivized. And when Sweden first began experimenting within the late 1990s, a lot of men didn't take it. It was the same as anywhere else in the world. And then when companies started pushing it more, it gradually became more of a norm. And I think today some 40% of Swedish fathers take a substantial amount of time off. And that's gone a huge way, long way towards making parenting a more sort of shared project. However, that said, a lot of Swedish women I've spoken to have said that nonetheless, the asymmetry remains. I mean, Swedish men might be doing more in terms of time than most men in the world, but nonetheless, there is something about this mental space. You know, women's mental space is often occupied by their children. It's kind of invaded by the kids. The children kind of come and plant a flag there. You know, they've taken over. It's a conquering army. And men often don't seem to have experienced it in the same way, despite the fact, I mean, they lose less of themselves. You know, their identity as a father is somehow less primary, even when they seem, as in Sweden, to have taken time off.
And there clearly are exceptions. I know.
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean,
Can
we're
I
talking in
come
big,
in,
big
actually?
sort of generalization.
And then
A friend of
let's
mine
go to
actually,
Deborah.
yeah. No, this is just a friend of mine says, men count the number of hours they're with their children. Wow, I spent 10 hours with my children this weekend. And women count the number of hours they're away from their children.
Let's have another question. I can see several along here. Are there microphones? There's about 3 questions along this row here.
Hi, my name is Vasjit. My question is for Pallavi again. You talked about points throughout the day where there are pressure points. How would you want to be handled by your husband during that period? Sorry.
I always want to be handled romantically and delicately, you know, that goes without saying. No, but I know what you mean. I mean, what I would really want my husband to do is more housework. There is nothing more sexy than a man who's washing up and, you know, who's essentially just doing what I do all the time, but, you know, not as something that's a sort of special favor, but as something that's part of life, that's just normal. So, you know, I don't think I need any specific handling, but I certainly don't want him to expect brownie points if he's doing a little bit of housework. And yeah, and, you know, it would be nice if he could kind of make a few more to-do lists in his own head before going to sleep in terms of what needs to be done administratively for the house.
Let's have there's another question here.
My name is Sushil Premchand. I admit to being a non-diaper granddad, and my sons are both diaper dads. And so my question really relates to an evolution of value systems, and I'd like the comments of the panel as to whether the value system change or is it just a societal change?
Is this something for you to
Well, I mean, I guess value systems are culturally related, but that doesn't mean that they don't change. I mean, here, for example, I mean, very often the family is what comes first. You know, it's a sort of a primal condition for anything. But then now, many of us are led to believe that, you know, we're individuals and we have our own choices that we should make, and this is an area of conflict. And I mean, I think it really very much depends on how you were brought up, you know, and this is where the generational conflict comes from. You know, I mean, I certainly was brought up to believe in the individual, rightly or wrongly, and And that's not always right. I mean, you've sometimes got to wean yourself off that idea as well, because it can lead to perhaps a monstrous degree of selfishness.
We're part of much bigger units, as we've been discussing. Deborah, do you, as a historian, do you have a take on this question of how one generation quite naturally seemed to slot into the role of diaper dads, and where a previous one didn't?
So what's funny about this diaper dad thing is that in the 1950s, there are huge numbers of articles talking about how many men are diaper dads, which is not what we would expect out of that era. So I suspect that there's a kind of overvaluation of the number of men who were always doing child work at any one time, which goes to Pallavi's point that maybe there's much more continuity than there is change. I think the basic thing in terms of intergenerational transformations is people tend to normalize what their own parents do. And so the biggest predictor of whether you have a daughter who's going to work is whether the mother worked.
But the thing with dads, I mean, I've noticed this in my family. My husband does way more than his father ever did. So this thing where you're saying someone shouldn't be given special credit for doing... My mother-in-law, if she sees my husband, you know, making a piece of toast or something, and just putting it in the toaster and giving it, that's, Davy, you're amazing. Your father would never have done that. What a remarkable man you are. How, you know, and it's very sweet. It's nice that she acknowledges it, but I'm sort of sitting there thinking, okay, but...
But I wonder to what extent that's even misremembered. And
maybe
so maybe Pallavi herself would be doing that to your child's partner, right? Saying how amazing you are to do these things.
But I think it's also the kind of things that, the kind of tasks that people take up, because I think men have a tendency to do the more fun aspects of housework or childcare. So they will do the playing in the park, they will do the reading of the story, they will do the cooking perhaps, but not the things that are sort of more on the level of drudgery.
Drudge work,
And perhaps not the disciplining either, you know, because that's kind of harder than kicking a ball around a park.
Yeah, I think it's actually just keeping track more than anything else. You know, it's this incredibly complex scheduling. Parenting is, you know, a one big timetable that you have to kind of develop over the course of your 20 years. And it's the mother who tends to be the chief timetable scheduler or whatever. And that takes an enormous toll, I think, mentally.
I think we have maybe 5 more minutes. So are there any more? Oh, yes. One question here and one question here.
If the father and the mother both are working, do you think that it works? It affects on the children's growth at some time. They get a little less time with the father and mother. So does it affect the development of the child? What is the opinion of that?
In what sense does it affect them? Are you wondering about their education, about their well-being?
It's all over. It's just a general opinion about what do you think?
Well, okay, let me take your question quite seriously, because if you had asked me this question 10 years ago, in some ways I would have dismissed that question. My mother worked, and I feel that I was more or less brought up okay. Like, I don't feel I was like horrendously neglected. And in fact, I mean, like you were saying, if your mother works, that's quite a strong predicator of whether you will work or not, and also probably influence the way in which you see this. That said, now that I have small children, I do realize that small children have a yearning for their parents. They crave their parents. They crave time with their parents. They crave their moms. They don't want their moms to work. Okay, I mean, the amount of like blackmail and drama I get every time I travel on work, you know. Oh, and you know, to some extent their dad as well. I mean, they want us. They think the coolest thing would be if we could just not work and hang out with them all the time. But I think that these are important lessons for them to learn, that, you know, we all have different roles, that the children are one role, but we also have other roles. And while it might not be something that they like, giving them things that they like all the time is not necessarily good for them in the long run. Setting yourself up as a good role model to show them that we're sort of active and we contribute in a wide range of things, that we do important work that has to do with people that are not just the children. You know, we interact with society in general in our different capacities, and hopefully they will too as they grow up. I think it's important to model that to them.
And I think I want to slightly disagree, because I agree. I think parents crave children. I mean, I know that whenever I'm away from them, I feel utterly torn. But I think it's possible for children to become really proud of mothers who work. And I think that we need to celebrate that more and kind of not allow guilt to cloud our judgment to the point where, we feel awful to be away from them. That's for sure. It's almost a physical yearning, isn't it, when you're not with them?
Yeah.
But it's possible for them to think, this is so cool. I know that I'll get back from Mumbai and my kids will want to hear all about it, and maybe aspire to do that one day themselves.
And one of the things we know from time studies that sociologists have done is working parents spend much more time actively with their children than was the case with the stay-at-home mother. So, just actively playing with the child, which has to do with the question of heightened expectations and guilt too.
Do we have one very final question? Yes.
Yes, hi, this is a question for all three speakers. As you all have mentioned, there has been a shift from the joint family more towards smaller nuclear families in India. And in many ways, today's parents are pioneering a path that their parents and their parents before them have not experienced. And the Western model of the nuclear family isn't necessarily directly transferable. So I would love for all three of you to speak to sort of the opportunities, the frustrations, and what the future looks like for parents and children when we seem to be losing our secret keepers and our characters in our stories, and to some extent maybe the other caregivers who might make the balance in our lives more easier.
Okay, I'll make one very quick point and then leave it to these two. One thing that I think is certainly happening in India is the need to talk more about motherhood and sort of, I think that there's more discussion about black holes and certainly the price of onions in the public sphere than there is about the reality of motherhood in the Indian public sphere. And I think a lot of this has to do with the idea that motherhood is something that you learn from your own mother, that it sort of is passed down within families and it's sort of natural. And I have to say that that was so not the case for me. First of all, when I had my child, I was living in a foreign country. I was living in China. My mother did come in for it, but whenever I had a question for my mother, she looked very blankly at me and said, Pali, but that was like 35 years ago. I don't really remember. And plus, medical technology had changed. The sort of orthodoxy on how you bring up a child had changed. And it was patently obvious to me that what your mother tells you is like no longer going to cut it in terms of help in parenting. And so in the Indian context, I think this is happening a lot because in the Western context, there's a huge raft of motherhood memoirs and parenting advice, and it's this massive industry. But that's something that hasn't happened in India, where we've had more traditional family structures, and it's still been very much, the joint family is in flux. It hasn't disappeared. And you tend to have larger families, and, children are sort of jointly brought up a lot more. That is changing. And I think because that is changing, we are going to have to see a lot of shift in sort of more public talk and discourse about motherhood and parenting.
Deborah, what's your answer to that question?
So, can I defer to Mahesh? Actually, will you?
Well, I was going to say something that's very mundane, actually, about where the nuclear family is going, and that is the price of real estate. Very often these questions are determined by how much rent you can pay. And particularly in the big metros in India, the big cities, rents are so expensive sometimes that you're almost forced to maintain that kind of old joint family setup despite your sort of willingness or intention to change it, Because it's a trade-off very often between wanting to lead that independent life and not having to commute for 3.5 hours each way or whatever it is. So, there are these very practical economic dynamics that come into play which affect what the modern family is becoming and the pace of change.
I think that's a great note on which to end. I'm sure you'll all join with me in thanking our excellent panel, Pallavi Iyer, Mahesh Rao, Deborah Cohen, thank you. Thank you, the audience. I hope we got to everyone's question, and I'm sorry if we didn't. I'm sure that the authors will be signing their books in the Crossword bookshop. Yeah. Is it called Crossword? Yeah, it is. Good.